Alright, hey guys, what is going on? Unexceptional Rounder here. And today we're going to be starting an advanced course based on Matthew Janda's book, Applications of No Limit Hold'em. If you don't own the book, you can click the link in the chat. Let me just put that back in there. And it should be easy enough to just click on that link, go to my website, and there's a few different books on there, but Matthew Janda's is one of them, so that's the book we're going to be using for this poker strategy course. I've never gone through this entire presentation to a group, so I'm not sure exactly how much time it will take, but my guess is it should be about an hour. If you can't stay for the whole class, I will post it tomorrow on my YouTube channel. And that link I will put, well, it should be below the video if you just click the YouTube button, or if you just go to YouTube and search Rounder University or Unexceptional Rounder, you should find it. The introduction, part 1 and 2, are going to cover all the basic principles that you must understand about poker before we move on to more complex poker theories and practice. If you already understand all these topics, then, just sit back and enjoy it. If some of these are a little bit confusing, that's all right. If they're all completely brand new to you, then this course may be a little bit more advanced than what you're ready for. And you can check out some of the topics are covered on my YouTube channel if this seems a little bit advanced for where you're at. That would be a great place to start. So, again, this is based off of sort of the textbook for this course is Applications of No Limit Hold'em, and I am Rounder, and this is Rounder University. So let's get started. So what we're going to talk about today is, up on the screen, calculating pot odds, understanding equity, why it's important to retain equity against strong ranges, hand signaling, equity distribution on different board textures, the difference between EQ, or equity, to expected value, EV, and talk a little bit about why hands cannot simply be ranked from strongest to weakest. At the end of each slide, I'll give about a 10 to 15 second pause for anyone in the chat to ask questions. If you're watching this on YouTube, obviously, I won't be able to answer live, but go ahead and put your questions in the comments, and I will respond to them. Let's get into pot odds. I've already done quite a few videos on pot odds on my YouTube channel, so this should be just a quick recap. Pot odds are defined as the current size of the pot to the cost of a potential call. In this example, we're on the river. Our opponent bets $30 into a $50 pot. So a player calling a bet of 30 into a pot of 50 is getting 80 to 30 or 8 to 3 odds. And that's just the bet, 30, plus the pot, which is 50, compared to the call amount, which is 30, or the total pot to the bet, or 80 to 30. Again, this should be a review for most everybody in the chat. When we are calling this $30 bet into a pot of 50, we're getting odds of 80 to 30, or 8 to 3. The way that's calculated is the pot, which is 50, plus the bet amount, which is 30, compared to the amount we must call, which is 30. So again, we've got the pot plus the bet compared to the call, or the total pot to bet amount. Again, that's where that 80 to 30 comes in. The next step is using this information to figure out how we must win when we call to make money. So this is calculating how often we must call. All right, so the equation for that is the call amount divided by the total final pot is your break-even win percentage. And that's going to be 30 divided by 110, or 100, so 30 divided by 80 plus 30 is going to be 27.3%. Meaning we must win when calling 27.3% of the time or more to make calling be correct. All right, so kind of went through that quickly. Shouldn't be a review for most everybody here. Does anyone have any questions before we move on to the next slide? All right, if you do, let me know and we can go back. Okay. Now let's talk about using pot odds to determine how often our opponent must fold for our bluff to make money based on different bet sizes. So here we're going to talk about us bluffing $30 into a pot of $50. It means we can calculate how often our opponent must fold for that to be a break-even or better play. So that's the bet amount divided by the total pot is the percent our opponent must fold to be break-even or better. So as you can see, we've got the equation here. The bluff, which is 30, divided by the current pot, plus the bluff, equals about 40%. All right, does anyone have any questions before we move on? And we're going to go through a couple examples, actually. So if you have questions, these examples should clear it up a little bit. All right, so here's a calling example. In this example, we're in middle position against an under-the-gun player. We're facing a bet on the river with a hand that is clearly a bluff-catching hand, we'll assume, based on player positions and the action. So how often do we have to be correct with our bluff catcher in order to be break-even on a call? All we have to do is look at these numbers. We have a pot size of 490. The amount we have to call is 245. So you should be able to plug that into our equation, our calling equation, and determine what the answer is. So what this means is we need 32%. We need to win 32% of the time to not lose money on our call. Any questions on that? Pretty straightforward. Everybody good? All right. Let's move on. All right, let's look at a bluffing example. In this example, I'm going to let you guys go ahead and do a little bit of math in the chat. So I want to see some answers pop up. If you're watching on YouTube, go ahead and follow along also, just so you can make sure that you have this down and get some practice. Here we're on the river with a busted gut shot. We expect our opponent has a lot of bluff catchers in his range and want to know how often he has to fold based on some different bet sizes. Then we can look at his range and determine how often he will fold to a bet of each size. Keep in mind that opponents will be more likely to fold to larger bets and sometimes fold a disproportionate amount to pot size bets and overbets. An overbet is a bet larger than the size of the pot, but that's a little bit more advanced than this lesson. So now all you need to do is take some time and determine how often our opponent must fold to a 50%, 100%, and 150% pot size bet. So I'll give you guys a minute or two to populate some answers in the chat, hopefully. So just put the pot size and how often our opponent must fold. Give you guys a second to do that. Whoops. All right, looks like the broadcast is going all right, so that's good. All right, not too many answers popping up in the chat. That is okay. We'll just go over them. So notice that as you make larger bets, your opponent needs to fold more, but not proportionally more. For example, when you're betting 3 times more, as in the 50% pot bet compared to the 150% pot bet, you are... sorry, maybe I may not have given you guys quite enough time. I apologize if you were trying to do the math, but that's okay. Here we go. So notice that even though you are betting 3 times more, when you bet 150 times pot, your opponent only needs to fold about twice as much. So notice that as you make larger bet, your opponent needs to fold more, but not proportionally more. Betting 3 times more doesn't mean your opponent must fold 3 times more often. So before we move on to the next topic, which is going to be understanding equity, does anybody have any questions about pot odds? Shouldn't be too many questions, so we will move on. If there's questions, we can always go back a slide. All right, understanding equity. Equity is the odds a hand will win at showdown. Just because a hand has more equity does not make it better or more profitable. We'll talk about an example, 9-8 suited versus Ace-9 offsuit. Excuse me. Ace-9 offsuit has about 65.7% equity against 9-8 suited. But which hand would you rather call with on the button versus a middle position open? All right. As we kind of already mentioned, equity is the odds that a hand will win. So if you can see here that Ace-9 offsuit will win 65, almost 66% of the time, a lot of people would assume that that is a better hand to play because it wins more often. However, that's not necessarily true. As most of you guys probably know, 9-8 suited is a much better hand to call with on the button than Ace-9 suited, and we'll get into that a little bit more later on in this class. But equity is the percentage of time a hand will win on average if all cards are dealt out to the river. Keep in mind that that means it assumes all cards are always seen. Because all hands don't go to the river, in fact most do not, equity should be understood clearly and not overused. Meaning just because a hand has that more equity every time it goes to the river doesn't mean it's actually going to make more money. And we'll get into some more examples of that as we go. But everybody understands what equity is? Percentage of time that a hand will win if all cards are dealt. So now that we know what equity is, let's talk about a little bit more of a complex idea, which is retaining equity against strong ranges. So for all these reasons we talked about, despite Ace-9 having high equity, we'll usually make very little money with it. We want to focus on playing hands which can beat the value part of our opponent's hands by the river and retain their equity well by allowing us to bet and call on multiple streets and win large bets with win large pots with big hands. So we don't really care how strong we are against the weak parts of our opponent's ranges because those are the parts of their range that they're going to fold. So when we say that we want to retain equity against strong ranges, the reason is because it's only against our opponent's strong ranges that our equity really matters that much. In our Ace-9 example, we usually flop a hand that has high equity versus our opponent's check folding ranges, and we can't realize our equity for a few reasons. One, we're not going to be strong enough to beat hands which our opponent calls bets with, right? If we're betting with Ace-9 offsuit, on most boards, we're going to have a medium strength hand, and our opponent's going to be folding all but the hands that beat us. When our opponent's value betting, we are probably not going to beat many of the hands in their range that they're betting. So we don't expect worse hands to call. We don't really expect worse hands to value bet against us. And when we do hit and our opponent checks, he will rarely have a hand that will call. So let's talk a little bit more about that before I ask for questions. So consider the 9-8 suited. We talked about the Ace-9 a little bit. We usually won't flop a hand that beats our opponent's strong hands and betting hands. We will flop draws and pairs which have outs to improve to strong hands that beat our opponent's betting range. Meaning even if our opponent has a strong hand, 9-8 suited can usually or occasionally will be able to draw out to a stronger hand. Meaning when we connect on the turn or river, we'll usually have the best hand, whereas with Ace-9, we can hit our hand and still not have the best hand. When we miss, we have very little equity and can force our opponent to fold better hands. Again, that's not really the case with Ace-9 offsuit. If we are bluffing with Ace-9 offsuit, we're usually not getting our opponent to fold hands with worse equity. Whereas when we bluff with 9-8 suited, our opponent is going to fold out hands that have strong equity against us. So you can see throughout this discussion how powerful it is to have hands that retain equity well against strong ranges. Before we move on, does anybody have any questions about that topic? All right, no questions. We're moving a little faster than I expected, so maybe that's a good thing. Hand signaling. Hand signal is related to the previous topic, and it's all about knowing what hands to play and whether or not we should be continuing in the hand. Even two hands with similar equity can play totally different. With suited connectors, we know what cards we need to see on the turn and river to continue, and we'll only fold them if outdrawing our opponent by the river was unlikely anyway. So, again, when we do have suited connectors and when we do fold, it's probably because we were going to lose anyway, meaning we're not missing out on our equity. So the times we fold a suited connector on the flop, we probably folded the worst hand and folded out a very small amount of equity, meaning we're not losing that much on the play. But if we have to fold out a hand that has, say, 30 or 40% equity on the flop or turn, we're giving up a large chunk of money without being able to realize that equity. So realizing equity is sort of an important idea to understand when we're talking about hand signaling. So other hands do not allow us to continue as often with a chance to outdraw our opponents, such as pocket pairs. So think about if you have a pocket pair and there's overcards on the board, it's really hard to realize the equity on those hands. Even though a pocket pair may have the same equity as a suited connector, there are going to be a lot less turns that you can continue on with a pocket pair when you miss than with a suited connector. And we're going to go over two hand signaling examples that I think are pretty good. When considering a call on the flop, consider not the equity to improve by the river, but the frequency you'll be able to continue on the turn. So again, take that pocket pair example versus a suited connector example that maybe has some backdoor draws. If you catch one of those draws, you'll usually be able to continue with your suited connector. But unless you hit a set on the turn, your pocket pair is going to be really hard to realize any more equity with. You're probably going to have to fold. So that's the type of thing you want to think about when you talk about hand signaling and deciding whether or not you want to continue. I got two pretty good examples here, so let's go over those. All right. So these took a little while to build and get straightened out, but I think they're pretty good examples of this topic. In the hand on the left, we have pocket sevens, which has about 45% equity against our opponent's range. Now, in case anyone's wondering, what I did is I actually went into, I used Poker Snowy for this, which is pretty much a computer-generated training tool for poker. So it's pretty powerful. And I used what Poker Snowy had for a range for our opponent with both of these hands. So I actually put in Poker Snowy's actual range and used another tool called Hold'em EQ, which pretty much gets the equity of ranges versus different hands, and plugged those in. So when I say that our hand has about 45% equity against our opponent's range, that's the range that Snowy has the opponent playing. So in theory, I want to be careful with that because it's sort of incorrect theory, but in theory, when we say we have 45% equity, some people may think that $75 of that pot should be ours, because if all the money went in, if we stopped playing right now and went to the river, then on average we would win about $75. So that's a lot of money that we would win on average if this hand went to the river every time. But despite that, Poker Snowy thinks this hand is a fold. It recommends that we give up that 45% equity and never realize it. And you can see that on the left by its recommendation. When facing a half-pot bet, Poker Snowy is recommending a fold. Now again, whether or not you agree with this play or not, you can see that it's sort of surprising that with that much equity, getting immediate odds, it's actually a fold. But that's the case. Now we take the hand on the right, however, looks much worse. We only have 31% equity. By folding, we are missing out on a lot less equity. However, Snowy thinks this hand should be raised, and also thinks calling is a positive EV play. We'll get to EV shortly, if you don't know what EV is. But we can see how hand signaling plays out very clearly in these two hands based on the theories we've covered so far. We should continue with the hand that retains equity against the strong part of our opponent's range by playing the 7-5 suited on the right and folding the pocket sevens on the left, which only retain equity against the weak part of our opponent's range. So if you guys have questions, now is the time to start asking. So with those examples, does anybody have any questions? Interesting why it's c-betting 4s through 2s, but checking 5s, 6s, and 7s. I'm not sure what you mean, Good Game Poker. Can you elaborate a little bit? Oh, you're looking at the ranges for what ranges Poker Snowy's betting. Yeah, that's true. That is kind of interesting. It could just be because of the pre-flop ranges, although I believe it was just a bet and a call pre-flop. Snowy opened. I called in the big blind. But yeah, Snowy takes sort of a mixed strategy. That's an interesting observation. But yeah, I think we can continue on. We're not going to get into too much deep analysis in these. We just want to get the general theories, which I think this explains pretty well. Okay. Hand equity distribution on different board textures. And building on what we covered from the other sides, let's talk about this. So having 100% equity or 0% equity is much easier to play than having 50% equity, even though they're the same average equity. And let's go through an example. Our opponent bets $100 into a $50 pot. We have 33% equity. The math obviously is pretty easy to see. 100 divided by 250 equals 0.40 or 40%. Since our hand has only 33% equity, we should fold this river. And we pretty much lose out on that 33% equity. So we can't realize that equity because we don't have the odds to call. And so because of that, we lose out on all of that money that really we, in theory, could have won if it was checked down. If our hand is very weak at 0% equity or very strong at 100% equity, we don't have this problem. So our hand is an easy fold or an easy call or raise in those situations. This is a common problem in 3-bet pots on the turn when we have 25 to 30% equity, when we often have 25 to 30% equity. So I just want to give it a second for everybody to kind of let that soak in and see if you guys understand that in general we want to have polarized ranges, which we'll talk about that. Actually, I believe that's going to be next class. But we want ranges that are either very strong or very weak. They're much easier to play, and they are going to make more money in general. Playing medium strength hands is much more difficult to make money. So we're going to go over an example, obviously. And then as I go over to the example, you guys can think of any questions you have. So when I refer to high equity hands, I mean that, let me see here. Oh, sorry, let me go over the hand example first. So the hand example is the cutoff opens, and we 3-bet on the button with 7-5 suited. Again, I don't want to get into whether or not 3-betting with 7-5 suited is correct or not. We're just going with that for now. The villain checks the flop, and we bet half pot. And the goal of our bet is to fold out hands that have high equity. So our opponent's hands that have high equity against us, we want to fold. And when I refer to high equity hands, I mean that any two cards above a 7 have between 20 and 25% equity against our pair. And we don't want to let our opponent realize their equity for free. So even though I'm saying high equity, I mean equity that's between 20 and 25%. When we check, we let all of those cards, any two cards higher than a 7, get a free look at drawing out on us. So as you can see, we are behind villain's range in a very difficult spot due to the board texture in this 3-bet pot. So what happens next? The villain calls and checks the turn. We can now see that Snowy recommends a mixed strategy. So we still are plus EV Again, we'll get to that on the next slide. But pretty much it means Snowy thinks we're going to make money overall on this hand. But we can also see that our equity is pretty even, right? We have 47.5% equity against Snowy's range. And that makes it very hard to play. So you can see Snowy's recommending a mixed strategy, which, I mean, you could say that makes it really easy to play since you can kind of do either and be correct. But really what it means is it's a very close spot. And it's a spot that we have to balance. It's a spot that we have to kind of play carefully. And it's not a straightforward bet or check. So that's sort of the point I want to demonstrate here. We have 47% equity, and obviously we often have the best hand. But our hand doesn't have a lot of equity against the top of our opponent's range. We'll have to fold out all of our equity to a raise from our opponent, and it's just a very difficult spot to play. Here we can see that having a hand with 100% or 0% equity would be much easier to play, and we would never miss out on our equity by having to fold. We either wouldn't care because we had no equity in the first place, or we'd call or raise because we have tons of equity. So now we went through an example of this. Does that make sense to everyone? All right, I'm going to move on. If you guys have questions, let me know. And yep, looks like we're getting through this quite a bit faster than I thought we would. Okay, so comparing equity to expected value. I expect that most of you already understand this distinction, but it's important to understand that they are different. Equity is, as we talked about, the percentage of time that your hand will win at showdown. This assumes that all cards are dealt and it goes to the river. Expected value is the amount you expect to earn on average in a given spot. So those numbers at the bottom of Poker Snowy, if we go back, that's how much Poker Snowy expects you to earn, and that's in big blinds. So on average in this spot, Poker Snowy expects that you'll earn 8.94, so just about 9 big blinds. Now, you're not going to earn 9 this hand. You're either going to earn like 30 or 40 or something, or 0. So it's averaged out, your average expectation. The only time equity and expected value are the same are when one player is all in. So in other words, if you look at an equity of 2 hands, like say you take ace-king versus a pair of queens, and both players are all in pre-flop, if you multiply the equity of each hand times the size of the pot, that is the expected value. So, players are essentially going to be 50-50, meaning if the pot is 100 big blinds, the players are going to average out to, the queens are going to average out to making a big blind or 2 overall because they're a slight favorite. But even though one player is going to win 200 big blinds or win 100 big blinds and the other is going to lose 100 big blinds, the average, the expected value is only going to be 1 or 2 big blinds, a percentage point or 2 in favor of the queens. Hopefully that made sense. But equity can still be used to evaluate the strength of hands. There's really no other way to look at a lot of situations, so you need to be able to go in, use some poker software, or calculate by hand the equity of different hands, because that gives us an idea of how strong our range is or our hand is versus our opponent's hand or range. Again, relatively basic topic, so I don't expect too many questions from most people in the chat. Okay, talking one quick example. So here I found an example on the flop and turn. It's nice to know your equity, but it cannot be relied on for making correct EV plays. So here in this hand, we called in the big blind with ace-jack offsuit against a button open. Against that button open's range, we have 50.5% equity against Snowy's c-bet range. I mean, even though Our opponent has a wide range, and even though he's c-betting, we still have 50.5% equity against that range, meaning we're favored to win by the river. We'll win more times than not by the river if we stay in this hand. However, Snowy's advice, and probably correctly so, is that we should be folding here 100% of the time. And it shows that we have a negative expectation. So even though we have what some people would look at this and say, well, we have 50% equity, about half of that pot should be ours, we're actually expected to lose almost one big blind, 0.67 big blinds on average with this spot. So that advice says despite our equity, we should fold because we'd be losing 0.67 big blinds in EV from calling. So that, I think, is a pretty clear example. We have, sorry, you're right. Good catch. Thank you, Good Game Poker. So we are the ace-jack. We have 49 point, so I actually wrote the slide, so I actually wrote the slide wrong. That's my bad. So we have 49.5% equity, but the point is still essentially the same. We are entitled to about half of that pot, or we're not entitled to it. Our equity says that we will win about half the time on average, and even despite the fact that we'll win about half the time on average, Snowy's recommending a fold. So good catch. Thank you. Does anybody have any questions about that or not understand why, even though we're about 50-50 to win, we should be folding in this spot? Or at least understand the theory. All right. Let's see. I think we got one more topic, and then we'll be done with lesson 1. So I think this should be pretty obvious at this point and after all the examples we've gone through, but let's talk specifically about why some hands play better in different situations. So hands cannot simply be ranked from strongest to weakest. Since the equity and expected value of a hand are not always the same, different hands are better in different situations. This is especially true pre-flop. And let's go over an example. We're versus a button open, which has a wide range. And let's say we're in the big blind here, facing a button open. A hand like King 10 offsuit is a much better call than a hand like 5-7 suited. 5-7 suited makes a better 3-bet, however, than King 10 offsuit, even though versus a typical range, King 10 has 52% equity versus the 5-7 having about 39% equity. Again, if you guys have questions about those numbers, I essentially plugged in standard 3-betting ranges and ran King 10 and, standard calling ranges versus a 3-bet and ran King 10 and 5-7 against them. So, versus a wide button range, a medium strength hand can win a decent pot. So pot controlling with a hand like King 10 makes sense, as opposed to bloating the pot with a 3-bet. In 3-bet pots, we need bigger hands to win. 5-7 suited can make bigger hands. We have the topic we talked about earlier, which is the hand signaling allows us to barrel high equity situations, forcing our opponent to fold out higher equity hands. So this is, again, a topic we've really already talked about, the fact that when we have a 5-7 suited and we have some draws, there are a lot of hands that we can continue putting pressure on our opponent with. When we bet with 5-7 suited and our opponent folds a hand, it's usually a hand that has a pretty good amount of equity against us. And when they do have a strong hand, usually we can make a stronger hand with 5-7 suited. We can make straights, we can make flushes. And those are hands that are going to be able to win big pots. Whereas when we 3-bet with King 10, we're forcing our opponent to fold out many worse King X hands in his range and only call with better. So that means that when we get into a big pot with King 10, we're usually not going to be beat. We're not going to be able to get as much money, and we're not going to be getting hands with more equity than ours to fold as we can with 5-7. So when we 3-bet with king 10, we force our opponent to fold out many worse king x hands in his range and only call with better. However, most folds our opponent makes versus our 5-7 will be folding hands which have a high amount of equity against us. So hopefully that makes sense. And I'm not sure. I don't know if I agree with that, because again, if you call versus a button open with king 10 offsuit for all these reasons, you are going to have, kind of all the reasons we just talked about. King 10, I think, is going to make a better call than a 3-bet. And again, these examples, some of these I made up myself, but a lot of the examples I'm pulling directly from applications of No Limit Hold'em. So some of this one specifically is, I believe, pretty much one that's right out of applications of No Limit Hold'em. He may have used a different suited connector, I'm not sure. But they're essentially examples that Matthew Janda used, and then on some of the examples I made up hands. So, all right, guys, any questions about the class? That went much faster than I thought. It only took about 40 minutes or so. So hopefully I didn't go too fast. I guess most of this should be review. I hope you enjoyed the video. Please leave a comment if you're watching on YouTube. Let me know what you liked and what you think could make these lessons even better. As some of you guys from Twitch know, I was planning on doing these 3 days per week, but the prep time that goes into them is a little higher than I expected. I was going to just sort of casually go through what I was reading about in the book, but that wasn't really something I could do, so I went ahead and decided that to really learn something well myself, it made the most sense to just go through, take notes, create a class on it, reread it. So I've probably read these sections in the book 3 or 4 times. I've taken notes on them, and I made all these PowerPoints and found hand examples, and now I feel like I have a very strong understanding of all these concepts. So I think for me personally, learning all this, this is a pretty good way to go through it. Thanks, guys. Appreciate that. So if you guys are enjoying this, part 2 is going to be coming soon. It'll be this Thursday, February 4th, 7 p.m. Eastern. And we got the Twitch address for anybody who's watching this on YouTube. So your homework for next time, if you guys want to follow along, is to read the following section in Applications of No Limit Hold'em. Again, you can just go to my website to pick up the book. And if you sort of look, this is going to be in the introduction section, or the basics section. And it's pretty much all the topics that we didn't cover tonight. So, let's see. That's about it. The only other thing is, let's see, if you are interested in doing a Leak Finder video, jump on YouTube. I've done a few Leak Finder videos recently where I take about 30 minutes of your play and see if I can help you improve. I do those for $15, so you can just shoot me an email with a link to your video at unexceptionalrounder@gmail.com, and the same address can be used to send payment to PayPal. So if you just send a payment to that note, link the video, then I can do a 30-minute Leak Finder video and post that up on YouTube. And if you want to see what those are like, you can just go to YouTube and check those out. Before I wrap it up, does anybody have any questions about any of the topics that we talked about today, which were these? All right. Well, if nobody has any questions, hopefully you guys will do the homework, and I will see you all next time. And until then, this is Unexceptional Rounder, and you guys keep on studying.